So today I would like to talk about one of the last compensation forms that I have yet to talk about, which is the commission disbursement form or the compensation disbursement form that we give escrow. Typically, if you use statewide forms, they're going to be Form 40 and Form 40A. So in this, in this class or in this discussion about these forms, what I really want to kind of pinpoint is number one, that we can decide who's going to be paying, why we would use the forms that we've chosen, when do we have to use them, and where do we send them? So who is paying the compensation? The Form 40 and 40A were created to be used in addition to the purchase and sale agreement. They are forms specific to escrow. Filling out the forms tells escrow who is responsible for the compensation and which side of the closing statement to deduct the funds from. As we get more complex, compensation agreements, these forms are going to carry a very heavy weight. So knowing where to put the obligation of that compensation is going to be more and more relied on heavily by you, the broker. We don't all use Form 40 and 40A. So when I talk about these, I'm really talking about the compensation addendum that we send to escrow. So if you don't use 40 or 40A, the same rules kind of apply for whatever form or however you make this demand to escrow. So when I'm talking about the forms, I did want to pull up what those actually look like, because I know here in our office, we do use this form. So it's good to know what you're signing. The one on the left is the compensation disbursement that is a buyer funded. So this means that buyer has already agreed in some sort of contract that we have put together before the sale, whether it be a listing contract or a buyer contract. Then in the purchase and sale agreement has also either disclosed that they were going to pay or is aware that they are going to pay. And then this is the third sort of step. That buyer still now needs to sign this paperwork over to escrow, once again, confirming that they are in fact paying that compensation. The one on the right is the compensation disbursement form from the seller side. So anytime a seller is paying compensation, this would be if there's a listing agreement, if the seller is offering to pay the buyer broker. So either one of those would be a seller-funded compensation. So when we look at these, we need to remember who is paying. And in order to do that, we need to reference the following forms. We're going to reference Form 41 if we have a buyer agreement. We're going to look at a 41C to make sure that everything matches what the purchase and sale agreement says. We're going to look at the purchase and sale agreement itself and make sure that it matches the listing, what the buyer and seller have agreed to. We're going to look at the buyer agreement if there is one, or a seller representation agreement. And then we are again going to look at the listing agreement. So anytime you go ahead and check the compensation, you need to run through this list of forms and make sure that everything matches up with what you think you're supposed to be paid. One second, sorry. Okay, sorry. Now, when referencing the listing agreement, we're just going to go ahead and look at what the listing firm compensation is offered, as well as buyer broker. And that's when we use a seller-funded compensation form. We're going to look at the purchase and sale agreement on line 17. We're going to look at a seller representation agreement in paragraph 5, if there is one. And when we look at the 41C, in the back of our mind, I would just like to kind of remember who is paying these things. Most of these things are going to be seller-funded compensation because the purpose of the 41C is to negotiate that. So if you have any of these boxes, the buyer and the listing has not paid any compensation and you're requesting the seller pay it if they agreed to, that would be a seller paid compensation form. Any additional compensation that the seller offers to the buyer broker is still a seller paid form. If there is a credit to the buyer, that means that something's being offered to the buyer's agent on behalf of the seller. So that will also show up on the seller form. And then if there is a reduction in the buyer broker compensation, that still means there is a compensation being offered, and the remainder goes back to the seller. So the seller would again be the one, this is the listing, the seller would basically be the one paying that. So it would be all on the ones that are predetermined with the listing compensation. These are not buyer funded compensation forms. All of the ones I just described are going to show up on Form 40. And again, this is because we either A, have a listing agreement, or B, represent a buyer that the seller has offered to pay that compensation. When we reference Form 41, we also want to make sure that whatever we have in our agreement is what we're being paid, not only with the purchase and sale agreement, but also with our CDA. We're going to go ahead and double check the lines below that we've selected, because remember, we can't negotiate anything that we haven't pre-agreed to. I'm not sure who's not muted. I'm so sorry. There. And if there's anything that the buyer has agreed to go ahead and pay, then that would be the one time that we pull in the buyer compensation form. So if the buyer says, hey, it's not enough being offered in the listing, I still really want this house, the buyer is going to select in here when you have this first conversation with them that they are going to be willing to pay that. This will also show up again when you have your discussion on your purchase and sale agreement. And although it might not be in the purchase and sale agreement, by that time, you should have had at least 2 conversations with this buyer that they would be paying the remainder of the compensation owed. And when you pull in this and use this, this selection, you're going to have that buyer once more sign to escrow the permission to go ahead and charge that to their side of the closing statement. So this is what the buyer funded compensation looks like. It's going to have general property information at the top. It will have spelled out in dollar amounts the amount that the buyer will be paying. And then down below, it will have who the buyer is paying that compensation to. And remember, this is just the firm that goes at the bottom. The buyer does actually need to sign this form in order for escrow to pay it as this way, because escrow doesn't have the contracts that we do showing that this buyer is on the hook for these funds. Escrow is not going to be asking for our buyer agreement. So this is the instructions. Think of it kind of like earnest money disbursement. Escrow not only needs the contract saying what we've agreed to, but the proof and the instructions on how to do that. So this is what we send when buyer is paying their compensation. Again, I pulled it up bigger so everybody could see it. The buyer has to sign this in order for escrow to cut the check to the agent. And below it'll have where the money goes. Once they do sign, escrow can disperse to the firm as agreed. They are very different forms, doing different actions. And just remember, if the seller is paying compensation, it's going to be Form 40. If the buyer is paying compensation, it will be 40A. So when do we use these? Well, right after mutual acceptance, when our contracts are delivered to escrow, that's usually one of the first things they ask for. So you're going to find this is being used pretty early on in your transaction. And it's great that we're doing it at this time because as the agent involved in the transaction, you're going to want to go ahead and double check all of these to the list of forms that I had in the beginning of this, the slides. You're going to make sure that all the numbers add up and that what is on here is what you are intending the compensation to be. This early in the transaction is the easiest time to make fixes. So let's do it earlier rather than later. And once you've went ahead and added up all those numbers, make sure everything matches, then you're going to be asked to sign this form to just confirm. So how do we know which form to use? These are just kind of, when you think about this, I want you to automatically think it's this form. So say you have a for sale by owner, and you represent the buyer. So the seller is unrepresented. There's no listing agreement. There's no seller representation agreement. And the buyer has a signed buyer agreement. And in that, they have offered to pay your compensation as their broker. This would be a buyer-funded compensation form. The buyer has offered to pay. For sale by owners with a seller representation, there would be a representation agreement on file, because remember, we can't be paid unless we represent that person, and we can't represent that person without a contract stating we do. So this would be a seller representation on file. Then the seller has agreed to pay the listing agent only. If you are the listing agent, you would do a seller compensation form, because you have the agreement that that seller is going to pay this bottom box here. That's the listing box. Now, the buyer has no promise of compensation at all. So this would be a situation where potentially you could be using both of these forms, and thus having the money come out of the closing statement on buyer and seller side. For a home that's listed on the MLS with an offer to pay the buyer broker compensation, the form that we probably see most is going to be Form 40. That would be filled out as necessary, whether we represent buyer or seller. But since there is a listing on the MLS that is offering compensation, it would be Form 40. The buyer would not be bringing any money to the table for the compensation. So if your buyer wants to pay your compensation outside of the offer price, so this could be a number of situations, but more or less off-market situations, then you would definitely make sure that anything that buyer brings to the table that is labeled as compensation is going to be 40A. All right, now that we've went ahead and signed this form, where do we send this form? Don't you worry. So here at the Madrona Group, John L. Scott, your support staff will be the one preparing the forms for you to sign. They will have you sign them. You just need to be aware of the process. So if there's something that comes in where your client does need to sign, like a 40A, you're going to know how that process works and be able to properly explain it to them. It will be up to each broker to ensure the accuracy and make sure that you're getting clarity as soon as it is sent to you. But once it is signed over, whoever's in charge of your either transaction coordination, or if you have an assistant, or even if you're doing it yourself, once those are signed, they are sent to escrow. So escrow knows how to disperse that compensation at the end of the sale, as well as put that closing statement together. So when you think about where to put these things, I just wanted to bring up the fact that these are actual compensation, and you can't see me, but I'm air quoting compensation. And we don't want to confuse it with any other type of credit for that buyer. So why would we not want to negotiate that on a 22A, like a closing cost? Because with the change of the rules, we have been explaining it to buyers similarly to a closing cost. Well, it's not actually a closing cost when it comes to the loan itself. It's just a cost of closing that is paid to the brokerage firm. So if you put it on the financing contingency as a closing cost, then it's going to show up on a completely different place on the closing statement, but also as a closing cost. When you do closing costs, you are also involving the lender. Is the lender going to be okay with the amount of money that that buyer is either paying or receiving if you're negotiating the compensation in that? Every loan has a limit as the amount of buyer credit they can receive for that loan. And keep in mind, anything above and beyond what they can receive just gets kicked right back to that seller. So if you want to ensure that the buyer or seller are paying compensation and not a closing cost, you'll want to either add it in the 41C, or somehow in a blank addendum, just allocating that it's coming for, from compensation and not from closing costs, not towards the loan, not prepaids. So just be careful how you word that. All right, now checking the numbers. We all get those final statements from escrow, and we really need to be diligent and thorough when we check those. There have been a couple that have come back that have been wrong, and once we've closed, it's nearly impossible to change it. So remember, compensation has to come from your agreement to represent, but when you look at your closing statement, remember who is paying what. So this right here is an example of a buyer-funded compensation. It will show up on the buyer's side, and the numbers will be in the debit category, as well as the amount of money being offered to that broker. And this is what a Form 40 would look like. The Form 40 compensation is going to be a seller paid compensation. So it's on the left-hand side. So again, just keep track of, is it coming out of buyer? Is it coming out of seller? And have I done this the way my contract says I'm doing this? Does everybody know what they are paying, where they are paying, and who they're paying it to? All right, so knowing how to read your closing statement is going to save you a lot of time and stress. Now you can go focus on building your business. So thank you very much for listening.